Hello, Athlete Mindset community. This is Bonta Sumii, the host of Athlete Mindset. Before we dive into this episode, I want to invite you to support the mission and purpose of our show. For $10 a month, you can help to make sure these conversations get to as many athletes, teams, coaches, and sport mental health environments as possible. As a subscriber, you will receive exclusive content and updates on current topics in athlete mental health, and you'll be directly contributing to the betterment of mental health for all athletes. Join the cause. Subscribe at sportse.io/athlete and make a difference today. Again, that's sportse.io/athlete. With your support and amplification, we can ensure more voices are heard and more individuals and communities are positively impacted. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Athlete Mindset Podcast. I'm your host, Bonta Sumii. And today we have a very special guest, Myra Sack. Let me tell you all about her, and then we're going to dive right in. Myra is an All-American scholar athlete who turned her love for sport into a platform for social change. She has led sports-based youth development nonprofits for over a decade, and as a writer, coach, and activist, she's the mother of 2 daughters and 1 son and lives in Boston, Massachusetts with her family. Her oldest daughter, Havi, passed away on January 20th, 2021 of Tay-Sachs disease. I'm so happy to have you here to bring awareness, to have a conversation, and to dive into all these very, very important topics.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
I appreciate you. I know you are the founder of eMotion. Tell me about that. What is eMotion?
eMotion is a nonprofit organization that really evolved out of Havi's life and death, but the foundation of it is based on my experience as an athlete, as someone who relied on team and community, as someone who grew up appreciating and sort of depending on and trusting the power of team to sustain us through even the hardest, most devastating moments. And so eMotion offers 2 programs. Our mission is to ensure community is a right for grieving people, and grief in the broadest sense of the term, that grief is really the human response to moving with loss. And so that loss could be death related, it could be emotional, it could be related to a dream or a right, could be a relationship. And the 2 programs that we offer today, one is for primary grievers, so people experiencing loss, to participate in what we call a movement community, which is a 10-week experience that's led by a trained emotion facilitator. And it integrates movement with these sort of contemplations and reflections. And over the 10-week experience, a group goes through it together, and they, over time, sort of pick up language and skills and really safety. And so by the end of the 10-week experience, hopefully they've built some sense of community and connection, and also enhanced coping capacity. And the second thing we do is we offer trainings for teams or organizations who want to learn a language of loss, who are people who maybe are managing or leading other people and want to know, how do they support their employees, their athletes, their family members when they are going through something. And those trainings range from a 60-minute Zoom to a multi-day intensive experience. And ultimately, we're on a mission to sort of change the way humans interact with grief.
I mean, and it sounds like you're doing an amazing job. I mean, the beauty of, and the adversity. I mean, I can't imagine as a mother, the experience of losing a child and all that is, and your process of moving through grief, and then now turning that into something that helps others. That is very moving to me. I know people, when they hear something so like unimaginable, one of the things people don't know how to do is, what do they say when they hear that? What would you want to be told or not told, or how would you want people to address you? Because you're very public about it. And that doesn't mean it doesn't still remain very private in the depths of your heart. So I guess for those of us who've never experienced something like that, for you, for people like you, and I know every human's different in how they process and move through their grief, but what are some, like, things to be very sensitive about and intentional and compassionate about when this topic comes up?
Thank you so much for asking that. It's such an honest and real and relevant question. I think about this in terms of the word remember, actually, which
Mm,
the prefix re means again. And when we remember someone, then, or something, we are bringing back into membership again and again that person, that identity, that part of
mm,
us into membership, into community. And that's ultimately what we want, is for our people to be remembered and integrated, even though it's so painful. But it's painful when they're not remembered. It's more painful. And so I think versus the opposite of that, which is dismembering, dis means to cut off or exclude. And so when we dismember someone, we exclude them from community. And that is the most devastating aspect of loss, is to feel like our person is not a part of this life, this community, this experience. And so I firmly believe that when we operate from a place of remembering, when we turn towards rather than act out of fear,
mm,
can't really do wrong. And so, like, real examples of that are just different ways of framing comments or questions, none of which I would have known had I not lived through it. But terms like at least are pretty minimizing. So when people say to me, like, oh, at least you have other children,
mm.
versus I imagine that the pain of missing one of your children all the time is so immense. I hate that you have to live with that. I'm so sorry. That is a totally different way of acknowledging that there is one dead child and two living children. And so I think the general framework of, is this a response that is sort of turning towards and trying to make a connection, even if we're struggling to find the right words? Or is this a response that is fearful and distancing, as kind of the operating framework?
Yes, yes. That's so valuable and important, and I think people are trepidatious and unsure and want to say the right thing and, like, don't want to re-hurt and then end up possibly causing that distance. I love the remember. How do you teach your kids to remember, Javi?
Hmm. Our second daughter will be 4 in June, and
Mhm.
our son is will be 2 in August. So they're little. In some ways, that's amazing because they're at a developmental age where they see so much life in death, and they don't yet appreciate the permanence of death. And so we're at this sort of magical moment with them where they bring her into existence all the time because they don't see it as taboo. They haven't been screwed.
Mm, yeah, they haven't been socialized
It's
to
been
right.
screwed up by adults.
Just screwed up by
Um,
adults,
yeah.
exactly. Right.
And so Kaya, our daughter, maybe a good example of this is that the other night I was tucking her into bed and she said to me, Mom, I'm going to hold Javi extra tight in my heart tonight. And I said, oh, that's so sweet. And then
So sweet.
3 seconds later, she says to me, Mom, I'm going to tuck Javi into my tissue box with all my other special things. And
Oh my
and
god.
yeah. And so just those two, like exactly how we experience that, going from sort of tears to laughter is what I do by kind of following their lead and learning from them. And then we integrate her everywhere. So she's, her photos are all over our house.
Mhm.
I wear purple all the time because that's kind of Javi's color. And so they associate purple with Javi. So
Mm.
they have Javi clothes, and so we just find these sort of everyday ways to keep her in our life. And then I wrote this book that was just published called 57 Fridays, which gets at this ritual that we had established, that every Friday we would sort of honor Javi's birthday, and we tried to see how many Fridays we could have on this earth with her, and it became 57, which is the title of the book. And so now still Fridays are our holy days, and they're the days,
Mm.
and our kids, Kai and Ezra, participate in those, as they did when she was here. So yeah, ritual, you're kind of getting us to what I think is so powerful in anything, in sport, in grief, in life, is ritual, is anchoring to places where we can hold the most meaningful parts of ourselves and either share them with others or at least share them privately with ourselves.
Yes, yes. The book, I wanted to ask you about it. It's a natural segue. I love how 57 Fridays came about. Tell us more about what you've learned about ritual. As a therapist myself, ritual, it can be a big word. It's like, what do you mean ritual? But like, it's an act of remembering, it's an act of honoring, celebration, however small, big, huge, tiny that is, it's a moment. It's moments. And so, what were some of the ways that you put together this book? What inspired you? We know Javi and your family. What were those Fridays look like for you guys?
Yeah, the Fridays were, and I love how you just talked about ritual, that I think it is a word that gets maybe overused,
Hmm. Hmm.
under appreciated because we don't often define it. And so those Fridays were moments where the rest of the world sort of fell away. And what it was about was honoring whatever we were feeling. So there was deep pain, and there was a lot of laughter, and there was music and dancing and good food, and always blueberries because Javi loves blueberries. So blueberries is a centerpiece. And then, sort of people in our lives are what we started to call Javi's posse. So people who saw her as as kind of sacred and not scary, we let them into the space and let them hold her and
Mm.
watched her body relax with them. She couldn't speak, but she could certainly tell you that she was comfortable and felt loved and safe, or she felt like, this person doesn't have it. And so,
As children know how to do, right? I
totally,
mean,
totally. And then at the end of those Fridays, my husband Matt and I would alternate who would write about the week. And that's really how the book came about, which was we started just
mm.
writing journal entries to her. We would write Dear Beauty, and that's how we talked to her. And we would just talk about the week, talk about what came up, what was hard, what was beautiful. And those entries allowed for Matt and me to connect with each other and access each other's experiences and feelings in ways that we wouldn't have without them. And then they let other people in Javi's posse experience her week in ways that they wouldn't have because they couldn't be with her. And once I started writing, I just couldn't stop. And so then the book
Mm.
process was about sort of turning those entries into a narrative that brought people along who never met her into community with her. And ultimately, I wrote the book and published it because I think I want to dissolve this intimacy barrier that can so often exist. We don't have real time, raw accounts of what people are going through and how we can show up and support them. And I know that what I wanted was either to be able to turn a page and feel seen, or I wanted to be able to turn to a person and feel heard. And so I hope, like my only hope is that this book could be of service to either someone who's going through a loss or someone who wants to show up for a person in their life.
I'm sure it is. I can't wait to dive into my copy and be with you, your family. I think it sounds like it's also so very therapeutic for you. I mean, the writing process is a way of connecting, like you said, with your husband, Matt, yourself, your community, Hobbies Posse, which I love. That's so cool. And like through your grieving process, you're helping the healing process of others. I think that's so important, but so hard. I think so many people who experience loss don't want to face it or are scared of what they might feel or maybe what they won't feel. Like, I think that there's such a, you had mentioned fear earlier of like actually allowing yourself to have your heart broken almost again and again in small and big ways to move through it towards healing. I don't think people can see like that's you have to. You talk about that a lot too, moving through, not around or above or to the side. But it's can be such an overwhelming experience. Like for those who are listening, who've experienced loss in this form. And I love how you talk about grief can come in so many different ways, different kinds of losses. What can you say to support and encourage those who are still in the early stages of moving through or don't know how to take that next step?
One of the hardest things I think is self-trust, is like establishing a sense of trusting oneself with our emotions. And I think that's so hard because we live in a world that can be really unfriendly and
Yeah.
predictable and harmful. And so it's so easy to get knocked off of what we know to be true about what we're feeling. And when we lose that sense of self trust as a griever, and especially in that acute phase, then all of a sudden we're forced to push away feelings or repress them or dilute them. And when that
Hmm.
happens, then we start to be really lost and really confused by what we're feeling. And so I think the first step is, it might sound so obvious, but it's so difficult, which is like learning how to feel, like
Mm,
accessing our feelings and being as specific as possible about what we're feeling so that we can learn to trust them. And an example of that for me is Javi would have been going into kindergarten this year. And so when I see a mom like holding a 5-year old's hand walking into a classroom or really walking anywhere, it's painful. It's painful
mm,
as hell for me.
mm,
And my sort of first emotion is often envy or like jealousy, you know?
mhm,
But then when I kind of get underneath that and get more specific, I realize it's not quite jealousy that I'm feeling. Maybe I'm feeling a tinge of that, but it's really, I'm feeling like anguish. Like,
mhm,
and then it's like, if I get underneath that, I'm feeling this deep yearning, like craving her physical touch. And I want to,
mm,
and then when I operate from that place of yearning, what I do with that is really different than if I operated from a place of envy. And so I think that's why that self awareness is the first step, because then we can start trusting ourselves and then we can connect with other people and community. But if we don't know, then it makes it really hard to be in community with others because we let some of the things that they say or do affect us, which gets to that community piece, which is, I think we let community off the hook with grief too much. You don't raise the bar. Like people, we put so much of the onus and the burden on the people who are hurting and grieving in all contexts, instead of putting the burden on the people who should have the capacity to show up. And so I think building community and infrastructure so that grieving people can feel safe is foundational.
for sure. So, so important. I love that calling out community to support those who are grieving. I've heard this a lot. Like people just are scared. They don't know how to support. They can't even imagine it. And so, this education that you're offering through emotion is so important and key. I think it's really amazing too as a all-American athlete, D1 soccer player that so many times you've learned how to not express your emotions, how they don't have a place in sports. They don't have a place in high level soccer or a high performer period. The old school way of like let's just grind of like we're not going to be self-aware or be aware of our body or our minds in the performance space, so for you to be someone who can model that and be so connected to it is so important for young girls, young boys, the upcoming generation around how they relate to their bodies, their minds, their emotions as they play their sport. I know that you, Emotion, are doing some incredible work with women in soccer and Common Goal. If you could share a little bit about that work, I would love to hear it. I know everybody else would.
Yeah, Lisa, on the first part of that, I so appreciate you said that. And I feel like I would have been such a better athlete if I was as emotionally evolved as I am
Mm.
now.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
because I would have been more creative and less afraid, and
Mm.
I would have scored more goals. I, I would have been bolder, but I was
Mhm.
so, I think you're spot on. Like, I think it's really misunderstood the way emotions can actually positively impact performance. And we know that if we're feeling restricted or contained, we can't possibly be as explosive or as courageous. And so I kind of wish I could go back now, and I would have been so much more productive as a midfielder. But the work with Common Goal and Women in Soccer, and so many incredible facilitators who joined the team from their places of work was really established by Naomi Girma's vision to put mental health on the map in honor
Mhm.
of Katie
Mhm.
Meyer. And then what we did was Emotion designed a program around sort of emotional literacy and how we talk about emotions and mental health in the context of sport and community. And we brought together just these incredible subject matter experts and facilitators to lead both professional athletes and youth coaches in a multi-day experience where they that was called Create the Space, where they got to be their full selves. Like, they didn't have to
Mm.
hide, and they could have honest conversations, and we could all learn and share with each other. And so I feel really privileged to have participated in that.
No, so powerful, so powerful. I love what you said about I could have been more bold and like maybe even beast mode. I'm sure I know it's like we always want to look back and see if we had this other skill or this other resource, how we would have been. But you are impacting the next generation again with this conversation, with everything that you're doing. Grief, as you said, can be related to different kinds of loss. You spoke of Katie Meyer dying by suicide, the grief of that, not just her family, but everyone who knew her teammates, everyone who played with her, against her, that kind of grief. And then the grief that an athlete might face from an injury, that loss, the loss of being able to show up with your team in the same way, loss of minutes, loss of travel, loss of that physical ability. That grief process, though, is the same, right? For whatever the loss is, there's a process that we move through. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's this deep discomfort with talking about and understanding the ways different losses impact us. And so I think because of that, we're left really vulnerable when the most catastrophic, painful, devastating, life disrupting things happen, and all of the losses that accrue in a lifetime. And each of those manifests in ways that we have to start understanding what they're doing, how they're impacting, how they're embedding in us, so that we can learn to move with them. And I think that the process is, at least as I understand it, is so wild and kind of
Mm, mhm.
unpredictable, and that all we can do is sort of bear witness to the generative power of grief, and then learn how to cope and what
Yeah.
coping means for us as individuals and for us in community with others. And I think we spend a lot of time sort of being afraid of people whose grief intensities are, if there's a scale of 1 to 10, whose grief intensities maybe like mine are a 9 or a 10, and maybe we're afraid of that. But what we fail to then ask as a follow up is like, 1 to 10, how do you feel like you can cope? Like, do you have what you
Right.
need? If my coping is also at a 9 or a 10, then I'm good. Like,
Yeah.
you
Right.
know, and instead, what I think we should worry more about is people whose grief intensity is a 4, but their coping is a 1. And so it's why like you're having this conversation and naming it and elevating it, I think is so game changing.
No, I appreciate it so much. I think that what I've learned, as a therapist, a mental performance coach with in the sport realm, world ecosystem, when people get injured, they don't, it's almost like a matter of fact that there's no sort of understanding what the loss and the grief could be. Like, oh no, grieving is just for something big. This is just my ACL, or this is just my hamstring, or something like that. When I talk about it, like I use sometimes the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross stages of grief. But what I also want to make sure about is that people think like, oh, if I'm not going through these stages in order, I'm doing it wrong, quote unquote. It's not linear. It's a process, and you live on a continuum and a circular pattern around those emotions, and not to be surprised by them, but that like you don't arrive, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
and not to expect that and not to put that pressure on yourself like I'm not doing it. Athletes always want to do things right. And like athletes like are so perfectionistic, and we know why. And like I'm always trying to like let them be a little bit more in the gray and kind of navigate it. But I think that the intensity of those feelings of like maybe depression, anger, bargaining, those stages, like you said, are a process that you move through. But how do you respond or cope with the impact of it? And I
Yeah.
think that's so important, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think, as you said, Elizabeth Kubler Ross's stages of grief have been so misunderstood and
Mhm,
misplaced. And that's problematic because if
mm,
we think that there are 5 stages that can be achieved, then again, it sort of puts the grieving person in the place of feeling like they are doing something wrong
right.
when all they're doing is feeling as they should. And instead, I think we talk about kind of moving with and giving feelings oxygen and space. And so that when they have space, they can breathe and then they can move. And we know that they always move. But I think when we resist, there's a formula that a meditation teacher put out into the world that suffering equals pain times resistance. And
Mm,
if you make resistance 0, obviously suffering diminishes. And so it's really in the resistance to pain that is the problem, not the pain itself. And I think that that's an important concept to kind of reflect on because we just resist so much that really
yeah.
needs attention.
Yeah. No, that's an important one. That's so important. Suffering is not the pain itself, but the resistance to experiencing it. Your individual, unique experience of it, because everybody's different about how that goes. If you and I were sitting with a group of young, I'm going to say female athletes in this case, who are struggling with their own abilities, who have not yet accessed their emotional sort of prowess, so to speak, you're reflecting on your time as an athlete. Like, what would you say with everything you know now about emotions? And what would you say to them about, like, I don't know, like how to be your best self, like how to use your emotions as maybe another one of your superpowers? What would you say to them?
Wow, what a question. I think I'd say that you're a gift. Like
Mm,
you as you are, like your personhood matters immensely and tapping into who you are at your cellular level and using that as your compass and quieting these voices. Sometimes I talk about this imaginary audience that we can create. These people who are following us around, either cheering or booing for us. Like, if we can notice who is in that imaginary audience and how do we quiet them so we can hear ourselves, because ultimately, our voice, our conviction is the only way to sustain the incredible work and privilege of being an athlete. I think I would say that, and to say that it's hard. It's really hard to be a young female athlete. And like, I honor that and give yourself grace.
On that note, Myra, thank you so much for your time. There's nothing I can say to follow that, and I won't even try. But I appreciate your time, your heart, your emotion, your lived experience, your story, sharing with me, with everyone listening. And thank you for the gift of today.
Thank you, Lisa. You are a gift too. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Athlete Mindset is part of the CADSource Podcast Network. At CADSource, we love podcasts. In fact, we love building podcasts, everything from development to production. Because of all that, we're growing this one-of-a-kind podcast network. If you have a podcast or looking to launch a new podcast, then we should talk. You can message me on Twitter at Eric_Kaz, or hit us up any way that works for you by searching CADSource on your social media app of choice. Let's talk about your podcast joining this one-of-a-kind podcast network, the CADSource Podcast Network.